good news of Jesus Christ is always good news for somebody. But it may not always be clear that that somebody is you. That doesn't make it any less good news. How does it feel to write something off? To write something off as a loss. This is a metaphor. It comes from bookkeeping. I don't know how you keep books, but what's that feel like to write something off? Frustrating to have the loss, or a relief to get it off the books? We can also say we've written off a person. How does that feel? Like a failure? Something's gone wrong? Or maybe sometimes a relief to just wash our hands of someone. It's a strange term to use like that about a person, but we do it. It's like the term acceptable losses. Now that's one thing when you're talking about a produce truck. What are acceptable losses? It's another thing when it goes into the calculation of a general. As little as anyone would maybe prefer to admit, there has never been a general who hasn't had that conversation. What's acceptable losses for us? No one wants to use a term like that openly, but it underlies so many of our public debates. Right? When we're talking about COVID procedures, we're talking about dealing with mass shootings, we're talking about the epidemic of drug overdoses. Underlying that debate is always, what is acceptable losses and how do we get below that point? It's how our society works. It's how every society has always worked. What would happen if we couldn't write off anybody? If we couldn't at some point throw up our hands and say, well, you can't save everybody? It's how our society keeps functioning. Sometimes it's how a community keeps functioning. Sometimes a family. I don't like it, but I can't fathom another way. That's what I see happening in this place called the land of the Gerasenes. It's across the Sea of Galilee from Galilee, the home territory of Jesus and his disciples. They take a boat across. There's quite a famous storm along the way. And then finally they come to the other side into Gentile territory among foreigners. For many of the disciples, this may be their first time in Gentile lands. And the first person they encounter is someone who is on the farthest fringes of this society. He lives among the tombs. He doesn't wear clothes. In Mark's telling of this story, he mentions he's always harming himself. It seems that the people there used to try to restrain him, perhaps to protect others from him, perhaps to protect him from himself, but it didn't work. He would get loose. So now he's left to wander the wild spaces and sleep among the graves. I'm not sure how we are to understand these stories of demon possession with our 21st century minds, but I'll tell you what's become increasingly helpful to me in understanding these stories. I find myself more and more seeing in them what we would call the effects of trauma. Trauma that was so much more prevalent in the first century. I say this even as a pastor who I think maybe a person who has some sense for how much trauma people carry today. Most people have been through some things. But in those days, think how powerless they were in the face of violence, in the face of plagues, so much death, infant mortality, and then most of them living under foreign occupation, and a brutal foreign occupation. I see all the signs here of trauma in this man. Living among the graves suggests some unfinished business. Self-harm, I'm afraid, is a familiar symptom. And then here, the fact that he names his internal oppressors with a name used by his external oppressors. He says, I called him Legion. the Roman military grouping. As if today you might say, my demons are regiment, my demons are brigade. Well, whatever the nature and origin of his demons, this is a person who's been written off by his community. They had to do it. What other way did they have? We see this with community trauma. Think of these places that are reeling from mass shootings. Everybody feels like they're drowning for a while in it, just overwhelmed. But after a while, some of them begin to find their footing. And finally, the community kind of decides as a group that they have to move forward and kind of compartmentalize some of that experience, that trauma. Some things are left unfinished, but they just can't stay overwhelmed. But maybe, probably always, there are a few who aren't ready to come along. A few who've lost so much or just saw too much. It's hard to predict really who it will be. And people wait for them to heal for a while, or wait for them to decide that survival means moving on, but they just can't. They keep talking about it, whatever it is. And at some point, the community, for its own survival, has to cut them off, write them off, consider them an acceptable loss. This is all very hard even to talk about it. So I was surprised to find a pretty decent treatment of it recently in a movie for kids. One of the latest Disney Pixar hits is the musical Encanto. It starts with a family with infant children fleeing some unrest in what seems to be Colombia. And it turns into violence and war, and the father is killed. But then the mother, with her babies, is given a miraculous gift. She receives a magical house to protect her, with a sort of protected valley where she can welcome others and protect other vulnerable people. And as the children grow, it becomes clear each will be given a magical gift to help this special community. But one of her son's gift is to see the future. And he keeps sharing these visions, and they seem to threaten or suggest threats to this oasis of safety where they live. They've made this little island of safety, but he won't stop talking about these threats he sees. So finally, he's driven out. Better to split the family, to cause internal trauma in order to keep this external trauma at bay, or so the thinking goes. And then they just try to forget, and they say, we're not going to talk about him. And his name is Bruno, and they make a little song about that. We're not going to talk about Bruno, if you've heard that one. And I think I'm getting this all right. If I messed up a plot point, it's because like half the movie I was watching from the kitchen and just catching what I could. Well, Jesus encounters a man like that, one they have tried to forget. He's out there, but they don't talk about him. No one sees him as a man anymore. He doesn't have any of the trappings of being human anymore. To the townspeople, he's just an unsolved problem, a residual reminder of something they are all trying as hard as they can to forget. But Jesus sees him and says, this is not acceptable. This is a child of my Father, one in the image of the Creator. He must be free. And somehow the demons know this, or the man does, that Jesus isn't going to just let the status quo continue. What have you to do with us, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? And they are right. Jesus will see this man free. Now, we haven't mentioned about the pigs yet, and they are a confusing part of the story. But perhaps the most important thing to know about the pigs is just that the herds around a town like that basically represent the economic security and the accumulated assets of that town. This is the bank account of the town grazing on that hillside. And Jesus doesn't hesitate. I love that about Jesus. He doesn't weigh the balances. He doesn't count the cost. He frees the man and watches the piggy bank go off the cliff. But you can understand, perhaps, if the townspeople saw things differently. Yes, they were amazed to see this man well. They were in awe and fear of the power involved in freeing him. But yes, they were also mad about the pigs. This written off loss of a man didn't stay written off and caused more loss, and they weren't consulted about the cost. And so they asked Jesus to leave. What is good news to someone doesn't always seem like good news to others. I get uncomfortable like the townspeople. I know that's probably not the side of the story I'm supposed to be on, but I can see things from their side. I cannot figure out how to run a society without some acceptable losses. I generally don't want to call them that, but if we're honest, we know they're there. Now, we as a society spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to handle difference. And if we're honest, we're usually pretty threatened by it. You know, a little difference is fun. We can trade recipes or something. But boy, you go a little deeper, and it makes us all uncomfortable. We feel threatened by it. Race, ethnicity, religion, gender and sexuality, disability, difference in generation. All of them make us pretty uncomfortable pretty fast. But this isn't about difference. This is about what can we do with people with real problems. We can't even handle having people who are different from us. How do we handle people with real problems like this man? Let's talk about veterans. We love to stand up and clap for them. Great. And lots of them go on to do pretty well. But I've counseled with vets who carried demons with them that originated in every major conflict of the last 80 years. And I'm sure it was going on long before that. And who wants to talk about it? They know the rest of us don't want to hear about it. Or we can just look at the numbers. Every major conflict, we have fewer fatalities. Praise God. And every conflict, we have more veteran suicides. Lord, have mercy. Our losses are happening here. Or we could talk about prisons. Who wants to think about prisons any more than they absolutely have to? I don't blame you. I think we all have the sense there are some people who belong there who figure out how not to get there. And I assume a lot of people are there for good reason. But what I know for sure is a lot of people end up there because we just don't know what else to do with them. And it doesn't do them any good, and it's expensive and ineffective. But what else do we do finally but write some people off? Or foster care. Yeah, some kids end up with a lot of issues. Trauma early in life, sometimes compounded by the system that's there to care for them, and we throw enough money at the problem to make it look like we're doing something. And some kids get the help they need. Boy, kids are resilient. Some get just enough help. But what are acceptable losses when it comes to our children? I hate every one of these situations and all the others that we could name, but I don't have solutions. Maybe we could cut down on our losses, but would there still be some? Some we leave out among the tombs and pretend we can't hear their sobs and cries. Now, in a Disney Pixar film, they get to simplify things a little. And some things happen that allows this magical family to understand that maybe the problem doesn't lie with what Bruno is saying, but in their willingness to hear it. And they're realizing that sacrificing one of their own is in fact too high of a price for whatever it seems to gain them. In this world, things aren't so simple. The traumas are greater, the problems are deeper, the compromises are uglier, but seem even more necessary. And so finally, Jesus himself became the one no one wanted to hear. His message that there are no acceptable losses, that no one of his beloved will be written off. He just wouldn't stop. It upset the careful balances we strike, the fragile security. It threatened everything, so he was written off. an acceptable loss so society could go on. And again, he did not hesitate. He didn't weigh the balance or count the cost. Still, I find again and again, I can see the townspeople's point. His uncompromising ways are upsetting. It's scary how willing he is to do what it takes to see this man well. But I tell you what, if it is me who is lost, when it is me who is lost, or if it is someone I love who is wandering the tombs and no one seems to know what to do, if it is me or someone I love who needs the healing or the saving or the freeing, then it means everything to know that Jesus won't hesitate and no cost is too high. Amen.